The land was white as bone and endless, a silence broken only by the groan of the wind sweeping across the frozen Wyoming plain. The sky hung low, pale and merciless, a ceiling of gray pressing upon earth that seemed stripped of warmth or mercy. A lone rider moved slowly through the drifts, his horse's hooves muffled in snow, his figure outlined against the vastness like a shadow without a home. He was a man marked by miles, dust of deserts in the lines of his face, echo of gunfire in the hardness of his jaw. Years of driving cattle and wandering battlefields had stripped from him the softness men were born with. Yet beneath the leather and frost, something remained unspent, though he would not have known how to name it. The rider leaned low against the wind, squinting into the blur ahead. His eyes caught movement, or perhaps only the stillness given shape. He slowed the horse, breath steaming in the bitter air, and then he saw it clearly, a dark bundle against the whiteness. The shape was human. He swung down from the saddle, boots crunching, knees bending against the stiff ache of cold. What he found was no corpse, though life clung by the thinnest thread. A woman lay half buried in snow, her hair tangled with frost, her dress torn as though she had run through thorn and storm. Her lips were blue, her eyes shut, lashes crusted white. Against her chest, bound in a wool blanket gone stiff with ice, a small infant whimpered weakly, soundless almost, like the squeak of a lost bird. The man knelt beside her, calloused hands brushing snow from her face. She stirred faintly, a tremor running through her lips, as if words tried to rise but could not. He leaned closer. Her voice came then, faint as breath on glass, breaking in the wind. It was not her own life she asked for. It was the child. She whispered that it was her last day alive, that he must take the baby instead of her, must save the little one, though she herself be left to the snow. The plea was broken, ragged, yet it struck him with a weight heavier than any oath he had carried before. He had seen men die, and had turned his back when nothing could be done. But this was different. For a moment he stayed kneeling, the wind beating against his coat, eyes fixed on the fragile face turned toward him. He could have walked away. No soul in the world would have known, and the snow would have buried the memory as it had buried so many before. Yet something in him rebelled against the thought, some long-buried seed of tenderness breaking through the frost of his own years. He reached beneath her, lifting both mother and child into his arms, feeling how weightless they were, as though the storm had already begun to carry them into shadow. His horse stamped, tossing its head, but he steadied the animal with a low word and secured his burden across the saddle. The ride was cruel. Snow swept against them like knives, and the horse labored beneath its load, breath puffing in clouds that vanished instantly in the cold. He wrapped the woman and child in his greatcoat, his own shoulders bare to the storm, every muscle straining not against the distance, but against despair. She clung faintly, her head against his chest, while the baby whimpered now and then, a fragile sound that guided him forward more surely than any star. He spoke to them, though he knew they barely heard, soft fragments of words, promises he had never given anyone, that he would not let go, not now, not ever. Hours passed without measure. Land and sky became one color, the horizon erased. He thought of the men he had once ridden with, men who told him not to carry another's burden, not to waste strength on those too weak to save themselves. But their voices felt hollow now, brittle against the warmth he felt stirring in his arms. Every jolt of the horse, every shift of her fragile breath, reminded him he was no longer riding for himself. He was carrying a flame small enough to be snuffed by the wind, yet powerful enough to burn his whole world into something new. He sought shelter where the land bent into low ridges, scanning for trees or rock to break the storm. At last he found a hollow, half hidden beneath drifts, enough to shield them from the cruelest gusts. He dismounted, pulling them down carefully. Laying the woman against the saddle blanket, he spread upon the snow. She stirred again, lips cracked, eyes fluttering open, just enough for him to see the desperate fire inside. She tried to speak, to push the child toward him, but he hushed her gently, tucking the infant close to her chest, pulling the blanket tighter around them both. He built what small fire he could from dry twigs hidden beneath the drift, a fragile flame dancing stubbornly against the white world. By the faint glow, he studied her face. She was younger than he had first thought, lines not of age but of suffering etched upon her features. She had fought to come this far, miles perhaps, carrying more than any human heart should bear. He wondered about the husband she had lost, the home now gone to ashes or emptiness. He felt the strangeness of sitting beside her now, a man without roots, and yet feeling as though roots were pressing into his soul with every breath she and the child took. The storm raged, but the fire held. He leaned back against the saddle, rifle at his side, eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Yet always his gaze returned to them, drawn like a moth not to the flame, but to the warmth of something he had nearly forgotten existed. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whispering broken fragments he could not understand. He answered with silence, only adjusting the blankets, feeding the fire, holding the child when her strength faltered. At last, as the night deepened and the storm began to ease its fury, she opened her eyes more fully. Her gaze met his, weary but burning with something beyond fear. She tried again to press the child into his arms. This time her voice rose clear enough to cut through the howl of wind. It was not only a plea. It was a command born of desperation and love. She said she would not live through the next day. She begged him to promise that when her breath failed, he would carry the child onward, that he would not let death claim them both. The words hung between them like frost on the air. He felt the weight of them settle into his chest, heavier than any rifle, any saddle, any years of wandering he had endured. And in that moment, though he did not yet know the shape of what it meant, he understood this was not a burden. It was the turning of his life's road. He pulled the child closer, nodded once, and in his silence was the promise she sought. The fire sputtered low, the wind moaned softer, and her eyes drifted closed. He sat with the weight of a child in his arms, staring out into the storm-washed night, knowing he had crossed a line no drifter could ever step back from. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled against the dark, and he understood the true test had only begun. The storm held the land in its teeth for days, gnawing at every edge of hope. Yet inside the cabin the cowboy coaxed a small fire from scraps of pine, its glow stretching thin shadows along the rough-hewn walls. The woman lay curled on a bed of blankets he had scavenged from the saddlebags, her skin pale as paper, her breaths shallow but steady. The child whimpered now and then, tiny fists clenching, but whenever he drew close, the cowboy found himself whispering nonsense words, fragments of lullabies he had not thought about since he was a boy. The sound seemed to soothe, and the baby quieted in his arms, eyes closing as if even in this bleak place, trust could still exist. He had not spoken much in years. Words had always seemed wasted on the trail, where cattle listened no more than ghosts did. Yet now silence felt unbearable, so he found himself telling the small one about rivers he had crossed, stars he had followed, horses he had trusted more than men. He spoke as though the child could understand, but he knew the truth, that the words were meant for the mother as well. Her eyes fluttered sometimes, half awake, half lost, and he wanted her to know she was not alone in the snow anymore. When she stirred enough to speak, her voice was roughened by fever, but laced with stubborn life. She asked him where he came from, why he carried no home in his face. He hesitated, then answered with honesty rare even to himself. He told her he had once lived by the Missouri, that he and his brother had fought side by side in the war until the earth swallowed one of them whole. He had wandered ever since, drifting with the herds and seasons, a man too alive to join the dead, but too hollow to belong among the living. She listened without comment, her eyes fixed on the flickering flame, as though she understood all too well the cost of loss. Later, when the child cried for hunger, she tried to lift him to her breast, though her body trembled with weakness. He looked away, giving her dignity, but when she faltered he moved close enough to steady the child, never touching her directly, careful as though she were glass. It was the smallest gesture, yet she felt it. In that silence stretched between them, respect bloomed, delicate, invisible, but undeniable. The storm outside deepened, rattling the shutters, seeping icy fingers through cracks in the walls. He kept the fire alive with steady patience, breaking twigs into kindling, feeding the glow bit by bit. His hands bore scars, his knuckles rough, yet his touch on the child was unexpectedly gentle. She watched when she thought he did not notice, memorizing the strange contradiction of him. A man carved from stone, yet carrying warmth he himself seemed unaware of. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. Night fell heavy. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries carrying hunger. The cowboy kept his rifle within reach, though his gaze lingered most often on the woman and child. He had carried strangers before, men wounded, comrades broken. But this was different. He felt himself shifting, as if every mile he had ridden had led him not to this shelter, but to them. He did not want to name it. Naming would make it too real, too binding. And he was a man who had lived by breaking ties. Yet the truth hummed inside him like the fire's glow. He did not want to leave. At dawn, the world beyond the cabin was drowned in snow. He stepped outside, breaking a path to fetch more wood, his boots sinking deep. The cold bit hard, but the sky carried a faint light, a promise that storms end even when hearts think they never will. When he returned, stamping frost from his coat, he found her sitting upright for the first time, the child bundled in her arms. She looked fragile yet fierce, like a branch bent but unbroken. She asked him, voice soft but steady, why he had stopped for her when others might not have. He did not answer at once. Finally, he said he had grown tired of walking past graves that might have been spared. She studied him long, and something in her gaze softened, as if she recognized a pain she shared. That day passed in slow rhythms. He fed the fire, she rocked the child, and between them stretched a silence no longer hollow, but companionable. Once she smiled faintly when he stumbled over the task of soothing the baby, the sight startling him more than any ambush. He realized then how little it took to make a man feel alive again, just the curve of another soul's gratitude. It frightened him, the sharpness of the need he felt to protect them, but it also steadied him like reins in his hands. Toward evening, a trapper came by, drawn by the smoke. He was grizzled, eyes sharp as a hawk's, and he looked from the cowboy to the woman to the child with a knowing smile. He left them dried meat, muttering about wolves prowling near the ridges, then vanished into the whiteness. His words lingered after he left. Strange how winter makes kin of strangers. The cowboy felt them settle into his bones. He had never thought of kinship as something a man could choose, but perhaps the old trapper was right. That night, her fever worsened. She clutched the child tightly, whispering that she feared her body would not last till morning. He sat beside her, unable to answer, every muscle tense with a helplessness of watching someone slip toward shadow. She asked him then for a promise, her eyes burning despite her weakness. She wanted him to swear that if she did not wake, he would take the child, raise him, given the chance she might not live to offer. He tried to speak, but the words stuck. His throat felt raw, his chest tight with the weight of her trust. At last he laid his hand lightly over hers, the smallest touch, and whispered that the boy would live, no matter the cost. It was not a soldier's vow, not a drifter's casual assurance. It was a binding of souls. The fire crackled, shadows swaying across the walls. She sighed, eyes fluttering shut, her grip loosening as sleep dragged her down. The child whimpered, and he held him close, rocking gently though his own hands shook. Outside, wolves howled closer than before, their voices sharp against the night. He felt the truth pressing in. He could no longer pretend he was a man apart, untouched by others' fates. Their survival was his now, bound to him like breath. And as the cry of wolves echoed again, closer still, he knew the storm beyond these walls was only the beginning of the trial waiting for them all. At dawn, the storm broke, leaving the land glittering under a sky of pale fire. The air was sharp, clean, and cruel in its clarity. The cowboy packed what little they had, wrapped the woman in layers of blankets, and secured the child against her chest. She was weak but breathing, and in her eyes lay a fragile light that had not been there before. He lifted her onto the saddle, mounted behind, and drew his coat wide to shield them both. His horse shifted, sensing the weight of the journey ahead. He pressed a gloved hand against its neck, whispering encouragement not only for the beast, but for himself. For the two lives pressed against him like the last embers of a fire he dared not let die. The snow lay deep, the trail uncertain, but he rode with steady purpose. The world was hushed except for the creak of leather and the rhythm of hooves. Time slowed into the cadence of breath, hers faint, the child soft, his own steady, but heavy with the burden of 3 hearts beating where before there had been only one. The land stretched endless, white plains giving way to dark ridges where trees stood like black sentinels against the light. He felt the weight of eyes watching. Wolves. Their hunger carried on the air, their presence a shadow circling beyond sight. He tightened his grip on the reins, every nerve alert. By midday, the woman stirred faintly. She asked how far they had to go, her voice thin. He told her a settlement lay days ahead, but swore they would see its lamps before her strength failed. She closed her eyes, trusting, and leaned back against him. The child whimpered, and he adjusted his hold, rocking slightly in the saddle. That trust pressed into him deeper than any blade ever had. He was not merely carrying them. He was carrying a promise, and promises had weight heavier than any snow. The first wolf appeared near dusk, a gray shadow slipping between the trees. Then another and another, until the silence throbbed with a low chorus of hunger. His horse tensed ears back, but he urged it forward, rifle balanced across his lap. The pack followed, patient, their eyes glinting with fire in the dying light. The woman whispered a prayer, barely audible, her lips trembling against the child's hair. He said nothing, only pressed them tighter against his chest, as though his arms alone could shield them from the sharp teeth of winter's beasts. Darkness fell quick and merciless. The moon rose over the snow cold and bright, casting long shadows that moved when they should not. The wolves drew closer, their howls echoing off the ridges, encircling them. The cowboy dismounted in a narrow pass, forcing the horse ahead while he stood between the family and the shadows. His rifle cracked once, the sound splitting the night, a shot fired into the air. The wolves hesitated, but did not scatter. Their hunger was too sharp, their winter too long. He fired again, the echo rolling across the frozen valley, then swung back into the saddle, spurring the horse into a hard run. The chase was relentless. The pack surged behind, paws scattering snow like sparks. The horse lunged forward, muscles straining, the woman clinging, the child crying out. He rode with every ounce of strength left in his body, the world reduced to breath, hooves, the pounding of blood in his ears. 4 hours they fled, the pack never far, until finally the lights of a small settlement shimmered through the trees like stars brought low to earth. With one last desperate push, the horse thundered into the clearing, and the wolves fell back, unwilling to challenge firelight and human voices. He stumbled from the saddle, carrying both woman and child to the nearest cabin. Voices rose, hands reached, and soon she was laid upon a bed while a doctor worked quickly, muttering of frostbite, fever, exhaustion. The cowboy stood apart, pacing the length of the small room, eyes never leaving her face. Each breath she took felt stolen from death itself. When at last the doctor turned, he said she would live, though by no logic he could explain, only by the will of something stronger than despair. She would live because she had been carried when her body failed, and because some men do not walk away when winter asks them to. In the days that followed, the settlement took them in. The woman slowly regained her strength, color returning to her cheeks, voice growing steadier. The child thrived, cradled often in the cowboy's arms, soothed by his deep, steady voice. He never lingered near her bed more than necessary, yet she noticed him always at the edge of sight, splitting wood, fetching water, mending tack. She saw how he held her child with a gentleness that belied his scars, how he turned away when gratitude filled her eyes too fully, as though he feared drowning in it. She began to understand that beneath his silence lay a soul that had long forgotten how to belong. On the third evening, when she was strong enough to sit by the fire, she asked him why he had stayed, why he had not left once she was safe among others. He paused, hands roughened from years of labor, twisting in his lap. At last he said he had nothing beyond these walls, no trail that called stronger than the weight of the promise he had made. She listened, then told him softly that promises bind not only the living but the lonely, that perhaps God himself had set his path through the storm to meet hers. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was full, humming with the beginning of something unnamed but undeniable. That night, while the child slept in her arms, she looked at him across the firelight, her eyes no longer shadowed by fear. She told him he had given her back more than life. He had given her son a father. The words struck him still. He did not answer, for words were too small for what moved in his chest. Instead he rose, walked to her side, and gently lifted the child from her arms. The boy stirred, then settled against his broad shoulder, tiny breath warm against the cold lines of his neck. When he met her gaze, it was steady, certain, unguarded. In that moment, she saw not a drifter, not a stranger, but the man who had chosen to carry them when he could have left them to the snow. Outside, snow began to fall again, softer now, each flake drifting like a benediction. The world remained harsh, and wolves still prowled the ridges. But within those walls burned a different fire. It was not sudden, not fierce, but steady as an ember that refuses to die. And as he stood there, child in arms, her gaze locked with his, a truth settled over them both. That family was not always born of blood, but sometimes of a single choice made in the cold, a choice never to let go.